In the polygonal complex of Ollantaytambo, many structures show signs of damage. There are various theories about how and when these might have appeared. Historical chronicles report that in 1537, the Spaniards attempted to storm the mountain, and the natives met them with an avalanche of stones. It is indeed possible that the natives dismantled some of the masonry and used the blocks to scare off the Spaniards. There are no questions about that. The questions remain only about the attackers. Why assault the steepest part head-on when the slope on the other side of the mountain is relatively gentle? A completely different story seems to have taken place with the megalithic structure that once stood in the upper part of the complex, where the so-called Temple of the Sun, or 6 monoliths, now stands. Its blocks have been removed down to the foundations, so neither the configuration nor the size nor even its original position can be reconstructed. Some of the blocks now lie scattered around the platform. This is not how structures typically collapse, nor does it look like it was dismantled by the natives. The megaliths are far too heavy. Using them to repel the Spaniards would have been far too difficult, especially considering that there was plenty of more suitable material nearby. This appears more like the result of some other kind of activity. For instance, a deliberate demolition with the intention of reusing the blocks later.
There is ample evidence that this was once a completed structure, not just a stockpile of unfinished blocks. Ornamental elements, the placement of knobs and bosses, the presence of clamp notches, and clear signs of facade parts being located in unnatural positions. All of this suggests that the megaliths had already been used once. They had been part of some masonry. Now they lie in new locations and in entirely different orientations.
Another theory explains the damage in the complex by suggesting that a tsunami might have reached this place, some 400 kilometers from the Pacific coast. It's an intriguing idea, but the consequences of such a disaster would surely have been far more severe than what we actually observe. There are indeed many damaged sections. The top row of blocks is missing from the inner polygonal wall in the Temple of the 10 Niches. Some blocks are missing from the wall with the gate leading to the Temple of the Sun. The lintel block above the gate is also gone. It now lies below, among many other polygonal blocks. Most of the outer wall of the Temple of the 10 Niches is missing, as well as one of its end walls. There are also losses in the facing stones on all the platforms. The largest are in the center of the lower platform. In the upper rows of the platforms, 1 to 3 rows are missing in certain areas. There are also signs of minor damage to the platforms themselves. At the same time, the inner wall and one of the end walls of the Temple of the 10 Niches, as well as the area with platforms to the right of the staircase, remain almost untouched. The masonry on the sides and backs of the gaps is original and intact. Even the protruding steps on the platforms have not been disturbed. All of them are still in place. It has already been mentioned, both in the video about terraces and in the configuration series, that the platforms originally had this very configuration. These are actual configurations, a technological solution reinforced by the opportunity to make use of the natural contours of the bedrock, not an attempt at restoration after a disaster, not collapses. In other words, the zone of significant damage is limited. It includes the outer wall of the Temple of the 10 Niches and the facing of the central part of the lower platform. And this fits quite well with the theory that the natives were throwing blocks down onto the Spaniards' heads. The story involving the Spaniards also provides a good explanation as to why the most extensive losses in the facing stones are found specifically on the lower platform. There was nothing there that could have stopped the falling blocks, and the element of surprise was likely absolute. But the blocks from collapsed masonry higher up would have landed on the platforms first, and then had to be pushed down manually. Now let's consider what the hypothetical destructive force might have been. For a tsunami to reach this place from the Pacific coast, it would have to travel some 400 kilometers inland, mostly through mountain gorges. And to get to the Ollantaytambo complex, it would have had to follow the valley of the Urubamba River. In the end, its front could only resemble a dense mud flow, saturated with a variety of debris, stones, and soil. And in any case, it would have left traces in other polygonal complexes that it could not have bypassed. Sites like Padalacta, Torontoy, and Cochabamba would have certainly suffered damage. It's also possible to trace how a mudflow would behave as it approached Ollantaytambo. At its narrowest point, the valley here is only about 300 meters wide. The flow would have grown in height, then bounced off the slope of the mountain. As it approached the complex, its main direction would not have followed the line of the valley, but rather gone almost directly from west to east. It would have crossed the valley diagonally, filling both its northern offshoot and eastern continuation, and with its left wing, it would have inevitably reached the structures atop the hill. It's not hard to imagine such a mudflow. It's easy to picture it sweeping away part of the complex located more than 30 meters above the valley floor. For that, it would only need to rise a couple of meters above platform level. But imagining that, after destroying a megalithic structure and scattering multi-ton blocks down the slope, this entire mass did not spill over to the other side of the mountain. That is simply impossible. Where did it all go then? There were no more obstacles in its path. The megalithic structure had been demolished. Now the flow would have been further saturated with debris from the destroyed structures. The path toward the inner wall of the Temple of the 10 Niches and the wall with the gate was completely open, and yet these show damage only in their uppermost rows. Next came the outer wall. This part of the temple has been demolished almost to its foundation. And after that, with all the additional debris it had picked up, the mass should have crashed down onto the platforms below the temple. Had that happened, the facing stones on the platforms would have been completely stripped away. In fact, not only the facings, but the platforms themselves would have been destroyed. Yet that is not the case. Nor does this scenario explain why one of the end walls of the Temple of the 10 Niches was demolished down to its base, while the section of masonry it was joined to, which had a much larger contact area with the supposed mudflow, was only slightly damaged. But let's return to the moment when the mudflow, having reached the necessary level, began to destroy the structures at the top of the complex. What should have been happening at the foot of the mountain on the eastern side at that time? Beyond the rocky outcrop where the complex is located, 2 extended valleys opened up before the mudflow. One headed north toward the Temple of the Condor, and the other to the east, the continuation of the Urubamba River Valley. The outcrop with the complex could not have obstructed the mudflow. Right after it, the terrain drops, which would only have increased the flow's force. And naturally, by the time the mudflow reached the level necessary to destroy the complex, it would have already begun to fill the valleys to some extent. That is, at the same time the structure above was being destroyed and blocks were already crashing down, a mud flow should have been moving at the foot of the mountain, its level rising by the minute. But on the eastern side of the base, there are no signs of a catastrophe of such power and scale. And it is clear that the blocks now lying there, blocks from the wall of the Temple of the 10 Niches, facing stones from the platforms, the lintel block from the gate, did not fall into a mudflow. Otherwise, they would have been carried toward the Temple of the Condor and buried among other debris there. The damage in the Temple of the Condor would also look very different. It is hard to believe that polygonal masonry made of smaller blocks could have remained intact. A mudflow would almost certainly have swept all of it away and then buried it under a massive layer of sediment. The same applies to the polygonal structures whose remains can still be seen in the town itself. They would have been completely wiped out and mixed with rubble. It turns out that the main force of the mudflow was somehow selectively and very precisely directed at the upper part of the complex. There it gathered all its strength to destroy a single structure, and then instantly vanished. There is also no visible damage on the southern terraces of the complex. A mudflow could not have passed by without affecting them. It was tossing and scattering megaton blocks just 15 meters away. Yet no comparable destruction is visible here. Just like on the large platforms, the protruding stone steps remain completely intact. Nor is there visible damage to the platform where the vanished antediluvian structure once stood. The damage is minimal and only noticeable at the edges. Moreover, it looks the same on both the eastern and western sides. And on the western side, there is a certain number of megalithic blocks. It's doubtful that megaliths know how to swim upstream against a mudflow. Thus, the direction of the mudflow's impact and the rise in wave height could potentially be explained by the configuration of the valley through which the flow might have reached Ollantaytambo. A narrow passage between the mountains just before opening into Ollantaytambo could have contributed to a rise in wave height and the creation of a powerful, concentrated current. However, within this version, it is impossible to answer why, while sweeping away megaliths, the mudflow ignored structures made of smaller stones and blocks. Why substantial fragments of polygonal masonry made from small blocks survived within the town. Why the blocks that were dropped from the mountain weren't carried off toward the Temple of the Condor. Why, in the place of the most significant destruction, the damage appears so selective. Why the mudflow, which, in order to destroy the complex, would have had to rise over 40 meters, left no corresponding layer of sediment behind. There is another theory, that the structures in the town, the terraces on the southern side of the outcrop, the Temple of the Condor, and even the platform on which the Temple of the Sun now stands, were built after the mudflow, and therefore their condition shouldn't be considered in reconstructing the event. But this version is hardly credible. It only accounts for the details that could support the flood theory. By the same logic, one could claim that the Temple of the 10 Niches and the platforms below it were also restored after the disaster. But in that case, the damage observed on them should likewise be excluded from any reconstruction, since it would have no connection to a tsunami. The only remaining detail that could be tied to the supposed tsunami is the megaliths scattered around the platform with the Temple of the Sun. To sum up, some blocks from the wall of the Temple of the 10 Niches and some of the platform facings could indeed have been thrown down by the natives onto the heads of the Spaniards. Those blocks remain lying at the foot of the mountain on the eastern side. They have nothing to do with the mudflow. As for the antediluvian structure, the one replaced by the current 6 monoliths, it was most likely dismantled deliberately. And this happened long before the arrival not only of the Spaniards but even of the Incas themselves. Why the structure became unsuitable is anyone's guess. It's entirely possible that it was damaged by one of the frequent earthquakes in the region, and it had to be dealt with. Wear and tear could also have been the reason it may have been taken apart as a safety precaution before any negative consequences arose, dismantled deliberately and completely in order to build something else in its place, something stronger, more durable, more effective, or simply something more needed at the time. And in that case, the cause of its disappearance is the exact opposite of a natural disaster.